This is the final podcast, number 6, for Chapter 10 on lesson planning. The first slide here is talking about developing the content, which has been covered in Chapter 5 and in earlier podcasts for lesson planning and unit planning. But we do need a developmental analysis of the content that you're trying to teach in the lesson. It describes the major tasks and their extensions. It's a representation of the teacher thinking through the content that they're about to teach. When teaching an activity, a dance, fitness, or outdoor activity, you need to know the critical elements of skills, the strategies and tactics of the game, the patterns of the dance and the appropriate music to go along with the dance, the guidelines for fitness or the principles, fitness principles, training principles, debriefing principles for outdoor education or adventure education activities, and examples of movements that transfer from one activity to another. You also need, as a teacher, to know the best organizational patterns that match the content that you're about to teach. They're specific to an activity and they need to promote safety between players or students in your classes. They need to be game-like or dance-like or fitness-like or outdoor-like when you are practicing them or setting up tasks for the students to practice. Those organizational patterns also define the transitions that go between learning activities. It begins with the introduction to the lesson, where your class starts when you're introducing the lesson, and then how you're going to transition from that introduction to the first learning task, and then from the first learning task to the second learning task, from the second learning task, and so on until you get to the closure. There still needs to be a transition from the last learning task to the closure. And where are you going to have them sit or stand or gather at the end so you can do your closure? You have to think through how you will move the class from one learning task to another and change groups or numbers in the group and so on, and making clear, brief directions and write them on the lesson plan. On the Winthrop lesson plan, we also ask to draw diagrams on your lesson plan so that we'll know what the organizational pattern looks like, as if we were standing above it looking down with a camera. It's the X's and O's of what a teacher teaches in physical education, kind of like what a coach does to diagram out plays for their teams. Why should future teachers draw diagrams on the lesson plan? It's used as a check for safety from the university supervisor point of view. We like to look at the traffic flow for drills and learning tasks. It also helps teachers to visualize the class and how it will be organized, including the transitions in between each learning task. And it's also a check for what equipment needs to be used for boundaries, how you define the boundaries of the actual practice area. On the Winthrop lesson plan, we have divided the learning experiences into two parts, the instructional task and the practice task. The instructional task makes you, as a teacher, think through each step, what they will do, how they will do it, and the design of the task. You want to anticipate the progression, anticipate the time of the task in the lesson, how the task will be communicated to the students, how you will demonstrate, whether you do it in whole part or just as a whole, the organizational arrangements, and the goal orientation. What are you working toward with the task? The instructional task ends up being what the content that the teacher is going to teach to the students. What is it that you want them to learn cognitively from this lesson? Then the practice task on the lesson plan is that you look at the instructional task. Now, how do you want the students to practice what it is you want them to learn? What are the patterns that they'll be practicing in? How many are going to be in the groups? In partners, are they going to be in groups of 3 or 2 versus 2 or 3 versus 3 or groups of 5? What are the conditions that you're going to have for the practice task? The distance apart, the equipment, where on the court, how many trials they're going to do, how much time they're going to do the trials in, are they facing which direction? What's the feedback to be given or the teaching cues? which actually there's a section about the teaching cues a little bit later on. But what goal will the students be given during their practice? That practice task describes what you want the students to do during the lesson to learn the content. The extensions that you give the students to do for each task are very important because it helps struggling students to get an easier task as an extension to do, or for those students who are getting bored or frustrated because the task is not challenging enough for them, then you would have an extension up for them. This also is what we call differentiating instruction for the students. How do you plan to differentiate learning for the students? The inclusion curriculum model says to provide 3 to 4 different stations for 3 to 4 different levels of ability in the classes. You're teaching the same task to all the students, but they're practicing the task, or their practice task is different for each group or each ability level. We also have something in physical education called teaching by invitation. It allows the students to choose what equipment that they use, what context they practice in, the amount of space that they use for the practice task, and so on. The differentiation of instruction means that a teacher creates a new task for a student having difficulty. Again, extensions up are more challenging, extensions down are easier. And in Chapter 5, there was a list of many different ways that you could extend content according to the number of people in a group, the distance they are apart, the type of equipment that you use, the type of facilities you use, and so on. There is also a column on the lesson plan for Winthrop for verbal cues, teaching cues. How do you plan to design verbal teaching cues to focus students on their learning? They are definitely related to the critical elements of the skills. So you would list the critical elements of the skills under the instructional task, and there should be a corresponding or parallel verbal teaching cue for each one of the critical elements you're trying to stress in the lesson. Words or phrases that focus the learner's attention on the critical elements. That's what we need for the verbal cues. Sometimes it's one word, sometimes it's 3 or 4 words in a phrase. But it helps the teacher avoid giving too much information, which overloads the students. We want to give them a clear image of what the movement looks like through visualization and verbal cues. Ending the lesson is just as important as starting a lesson. The lesson closure completes the lesson. You review what was learned during the lesson. You check the student's understanding to make sure that they understand what it was that you tried to accomplish in the lesson for the day, which is an assessment. You can do that with questions. You can do it with more formal assessments. But you also want to orient the students for the next lesson. You're trying to show them through the closure and through the introduction how you are chaining or linking each bit of content or chunk of content together to build from simple to more complex. The closure is also used for an assessment by the teacher. Sometimes assessment is done during the actual lesson and during learning tasks, but most of the time it's done at the end of the lesson. Sometimes it's questioning by the teacher. Sometimes it's a student demonstration of skills, taking a sample of students from the class and asking them to demonstrate the different skills will help you to know that the whole class has probably gotten it. Journal writing at the end. It could be an exit slip where you ask them to write down in 2 minutes everything they can remember that they learned today in the lesson. The last thing that's part of the closure is the cool down. And many physical education teachers forget to do this at the end. But after you've worked out and they've worked really hard, it's very important to stretch out, do static stretching at the end of the lesson to improve flexibility. The last and probably the most important part of the lesson plan is the section on references and resources. Beginning teachers do not use enough resources and references outside of their college PHED classes listed on the references. In fact, I've gotten to the point I think we shouldn't even allow the PHED courses to be put on there because PHED majors and interns need to make sure that they use book resources, print resources, internet resources to help them learn more about activities as much as possible. most of our PET majors don't know anything about cricket. So I've thought many times about trying to get you to develop a unit plan on cricket. You definitely would have to use resources for that and references. The problem about not using references and resources is that it makes it seem like you know everything there is to know about tennis, or you know everything there is to know about ultimate frisbee, when I know for sure that you need to find out more about each one of these activities. Textbooks are good resources. State K through 12 physical education content standards are another resource. Books, print books, internet websites, journal articles are all examples of references and resources that you can use, so that you will not assume that students know something, and you do look at the detail of the critical elements that you need to be teaching them. They also need to be in APA style, which is posted on Blackboard. This is the end of podcast number 6 for Chapter 10 on lesson planning.